farmers, agricultural workers, factory and warehouse workers, paramedics and healthcare workers, custodians, childcare providers, truck drivers, and train conductors. What do all of these people have in common? They are essential workers. They are the workforce behind our workforce. They grow, harvest, and produce the food that stocks our shelves. They treat our sick and care for our elders. They move people and products locally and nationally. They clean and disinfect our buildings. And they're the ones that employers and employees alike rely upon to take care of our kids during the workdays. They are the backbone of American society. And in this age of COVID, they're the ones that we are relying upon the most. But all too often, these are people who are working at minimum wage or slightly higher. They often have more than one job to make ends meet. They often have no employer-based health insurance, no paid sick leave, and very few vacation days. All too often, they are living on the brink of poverty. What does it mean to live in poverty? In a nutshell, it means not having enough money to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. Poverty is contrary to the sacred American value of success through hard work. In fact, the dominant narrative around poverty is very much the same as that about wealth. You've heard it all before. That expression about pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. The notion that anyone in America can make it, regardless of race, gender, or national origin, and be successful in America. After all, success and work is part of the American narrative. It's embedded in our folklore from our first job, from high school to climbing up the ladder of success. Conversely, if one can't make it, it has something to do with some personal failing, perhaps a lack of motivation, weak will, or sheer laziness. Usually this expression is followed by some story of upward mobility, oftentimes in our own family. How about the immigrant who comes to America with the shirt on his back and pennies in his pocket, driven solely by the motivation of finding a better life for himself and his family? Or the person of color who overcomes the odds and escapes the clutches of the violent inner city to make a better life for himself? Or how about the person who wants to escape the hard-scrabble life of his blue-collar town and escape the fate of his father and his grandfather and carve out a better life for himself? All of these stories require an unrelenting belief that in America, upward mobility and financial security are easily possible by hard work, determination, and grit. And conversely, the inability to be able to do so has something to do with some moral failing. Now, it's not that these stories aren't true, or that they're not inspiring, or that we aren't loving stories of rags to riches and believe that anyone can make it in America. But with 65 million people living at or below poverty, it's hard to believe that this many people have gotten into this situation simply by some lack of will. And therein lies the problem with the bootstraps narrative. It conveniently ignores the systemic roots of inequality in America. And for people of color, it also conveniently ignores the legacy of white supremacy as it pertains to wealth building. Our society has long wrestled with its deep-rooted resentment of people living in poverty. Even the way that we talk about poor people, we make sweeping generalizations and heap most of the blame upon the individual for the condition in which he finds himself. This general notion that people living in poverty are somehow irresponsible or lazy has been around for centuries, from as early as the 1300s in England. And this notion was codified in the English poor laws of the 1800s, which made the distinction of deserving, think elderly or people with disabilities, and undeserving, otherwise able-bodied people. This distinction has been woven into every aspect of American social welfare policy today. And this aversion is made worse by America's legacy of slavery and racial subjugation. Now, a lot of our rhetoric is blatantly racist. Ever heard of the Cadillac driving welfare queen? That trope from the 1980s that still exists today? But some of our rhetoric is a bit more about semantics. Welfare versus subsidies, handouts versus investments, and other coded language used to justify our willingness to help some people while refusing to help others. And many of our American success stories are very carefully crafted to de-emphasize our hypocrisy. Think for a second about the pioneers of the American West. These were individuals who were inspired by manifest destiny, the belief that it was the destiny of the United States to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But this massive expansion could not have happened without the Homestead Act. The act allowed anyone to request a parcel of land for free and who could live on it so long as they showed that they had improved the land. As a consequence of the act, 10% of America's lands today were handed out through homesteads. And 25% of Americans today can attribute their family wealth, at least in part, to the Homestead Act. And that's why the Bootstraps narrative is not only inaccurate, it's damaging, especially in this day and age when our country is in the grips of a pandemic that has taken hundreds of thousands of American lives alone and sickened millions more. And it's not only about the human toll of COVID. COVID has decimated American businesses and destabilized our economy. States and local governments are trying to balance the needs of their economies with the safety of their citizens. But yet and still, we continue to push this narrative. We're quick to support our industries, but we're less quick to support our individuals. In fact, lawmakers continue to debate whether giving a second stimulus check would actually incentivize people to stay at home instead of find work. Eventually, the pandemic will subside, and Americans will settle into a new normal of sorts. But that's all the more reason why we need to change this Bootstraps narrative. Many of our anti-poverty programs are still focused on the individuals and their shortcomings, and conveniently ignore the role that society plays in the conditions in which they find themselves. In fact, many Americans work very hard at their jobs and hold more than one job right now. So how do we go about unbuckling this Bootstraps narrative? First and foremost, we must stop treating poverty like some sort of moral failing or a testament to one's character. COVID is a prime example of that. During this period of time, more people have fallen into poverty by no fault of their own. That first stimulus check was of immeasurable help to families. But as the crisis worsened, more and more people needed benefits. There was an exponential demand for unemployment insurance and other sorts of public benefits. That's why it's so important that we not think that investing in our people will create some sort of dependence. Secondly, we need to stop focusing on fixing individuals in poverty, but instead focusing on dismantling the systems that keep people mired in poverty. Structural racism was born out of slavery and continues to keep people mired in poverty. For example, are you aware that there was a second Homestead Act, the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, that was meant explicitly to include Black people? The problem was rampant racial discrimination prevented the proper application of the act. And that's why we have to be more honest about our narrative when it comes to wealth and poverty in this country, and more importantly, racism and the systems that keep people oppressed. At a simpler level, we have to acknowledge the immense power of our words. Even those of us with the best of intentions may unknowingly reinforce our bias towards the poor by labeling people as poor instead of people experiencing economic hardships. We must all acknowledge the humanity in everyone and that we are not our circumstance. All of us are people with aspirations, potentials, and goals that are worthy of achievement. We want to achieve economic and racial justice for everyone. By the way, the expression pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, that expression was coined in the early 1800s, but it was actually meant to refer to something that was absurd. Now, clearly that definition has changed over the years and the irony has been lost. But in this day and age, We'd all be better served by unbuckling this bootstraps narrative once and for all.